Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we are going to discuss Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 25th of November 2020. The articles which we have taken for today's discussion are displayed on your screen. Let us now begin the discussion.
Dear students, Rouse IAS Prelims Test Series 2021 is a complete testing and revision course for the upcoming prelims examination. The program will help you prepare for UPSC prelims through a step-up approach. It is a meticulously designed study plan to organize your preparation and keep you on track towards covering the prelims GS and CSAT syllabus extensively from NCERT to the advanced level. The goal of our Prelims Test Series 2021 program is to exhaustively cover all standard sources of study material, including NCERT, with a study plan to test you at par with UPSC level of questions, thereby improving your chances of clearing the prelims examination. To give multiple revision of the entire syllabus from the perspective of civil service prelims pattern, the test series program will also give you the final revision of all topics and themes before the examination through QIP videos and prelims compass notes. The QIP videos or quality improvement program videos are for speedy revision of all important topics for the upcoming prelims examination. QIP videos are kind of crash course for the prelims examination. And prelims compass are 8 subject-wise prelims compilation of all static and current affair topics important for the upcoming prelims. Rouse IAS Prelims Test Series 2021 will include topics test, testing the concept of candidate. It will include thematic test on both the concept and the current affair of that particular theme. It will also include current affair tests covering the monthly current affairs. And there will be full-length test before the final exam to simulate you for the D-Day. There is a link in the description of this video. You can click on the link for registration and to also check out the demo QIP videos.
Before we begin the discussion, let us have a look at few of the statements which you have to find yourself whether they are true or false based on the discussion. Section 124 of IPC deals with sedition. Kedarnath Singh versus State of Bihar case widened the scope of sedition in India. Stunted means too short for their age but not necessarily thin. Wasted means too thin for their height but not necessarily short. According to National Family Health Survey 4, more than a third of children under the age of 5 face stunting and wasting. Sputnik 5 vaccine is based on mRNA. As of March 2019, PSBs had rupees 80 lakh crore in deposits and gave loans of rupees 58 lakh crore, accounting for almost 70% of the market share in the banking sector. The minimum initial paid up capital for setting up new private bank was set at rupees 500 crores. You will find the answers to these true and false statements towards the end of the discussion. The first article which we have taken for today's discussion appears on page number 2. Umar, veteran of sedition, say police in riots charge sheet. So Delhi police in a supplementary charge sheet in a Northeast Delhi riots case described former JNU student Umar Khalid as a veteran of sedition who was the silent whisper behind the first phase of riots that took place in December 2019. Because of which subsequently sedition cases were filed against Umar Khalid along with many others, and now the police has filed the charge sheet. Now this particular instance gives us an opportunity to visit sedition in detail so that you can write answers in mains GS paper 2. Because there is a sentence in the syllabus which says functions and responsibilities of the union and the state. Now sedition as an important provision of Indian Penal Code has been appearing in the newspaper a lot, especially in last 2 to 3 years where a lot of sedition cases have been filed against journalists, anti-CAA and NRC protesters, and various other student and political leaders. In this regard, it becomes important for us to first understand what sedition is and where does it find its place in Indian law or legal system. Then we will understand what have been the applications, uses and misuses of this particular law in recent times, so that you will be in a position to substantiate your arguments against the sedition law with proper facts and events. And then we will understand two important Supreme Court judgments which have tried to curtail the misuse of sedition law, and then finally we'll look into the arguments both against as well as in favor of this particular sedition law, finally leading us to what should be the way forward. So let us now begin the discussion. So before anything, let us just first understand the meaning of the word sedition. Sedition is a very particular term which denotes an act which is an incitement of discontent against the government, or an act which leads to rebellion against the government. Or in other words, any action, especially in speech or writing, which promotes discontent or rebellion against the government. Now that is problematic even in a democratic setup, because in democratic setup, the Constitution of India lays down a procedure through which a government is formed, and it also at the same time lays down the procedure through which a particular government can be removed. Apart from that, various mechanisms being provided in the Constitution and law provide for enough safety mechanisms so that the government actions can be challenged. And so it is safe to assume that a lot of checks and balances have been provided, not only within the institutions but also to the common public, through which all illegal and immoral actions of the government can be challenged and can be stalled. And so the idea behind the sedition law is that if so many mechanisms have been provided in the hands of the citizenry, there is no need for the citizens to rebel against the state or against the government. Now the problem over here is that there is a very thin line between the criticism of a government or a state and incitement of discontent or leading to rebellion. And that thin line is where the problem and issues of uses and misuses with respect to the sedition law comes into play. And let us understand how the wording of section 124A of IPC, which provides for the penalty against the sedition, comes into play. So section 124A of IPC creates mechanism to check sedition in our country, and you should be surprised to know that it was introduced by British Raj in 1870. Now the problem is not that it was introduced by Britishers, because a lot of laws which we use currently have been introduced by Britishers, but the problem is that it was introduced by Britishers in order to check the nationalist movement, in order to arrest and send the freedom fighters to jail. And that's where the problem lies. We are continuing with the law which was enacted to curb our own freedoms, and since independence we have still stuck to the same law which Britishers themselves have repealed. So let us now look at section 124A and see what it talks about. Whoever, by words either spoken or written, or by signs, or by visible representation, or otherwise brings or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt, or excites or attempts to excite disaffection towards the government established by law in India, shall be punished with imprisonment for life, to which fine may be added. So it starts with whoever, which means it is applicable to anyone. Then the actions being committed by that whoever person can range from speech, drawing, or any other kind of visible representation which either directly brings or which the state or the government thinks is attempting to bring either contempt or hatred or disaffection against the government established by law. Now these words are where the problems start. Although section 124 of IPC contains few explanations as well. So this explanation number 1 says that the expression disaffection includes disloyalty and all feelings of enmity. So whenever an action induces disloyalty in the citizens, the provisions of section 124 or the sedition can be applicable. But there are two other sets of explanation which try to put a limit on the misuse of the sedition law, which is comments expressing disapprobation of measures of the government with a view to obtain their alteration by lawful means without exciting or attempting to excite hatred, contempt, or disaffection do not constitute an offense under this section. And similarly, criticism of administration through lawful means shall not be considered as sedition. So, which means that, let's say there is a scheme, Atmanirbhar Bharat, a journalist publishes an article criticizing measures taken by the government of India in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, that criticism, as well as if the journalist or the writer of the article suggests some alteration in the policy, and since she is doing it through lawful means, which means that the article nowhere suggests the replacement of the government, it just talks about alteration of the policy or government policy or the administration, it shall not be counted in sedition. So now the cursory reading of this particular section, the provision against sedition, will lead you to believe that everything is good and there is no problem, and so why the fuss? And to judge the efficacy of any law, you have to look at its applications. And now let's see few of the prominent cases in past 10 years and see how in reality the provisions of the section 124A have been used by various state governments. Starting with arrest of Asim Trivedi in 2012. So cartoonist Asim Trivedi was arrested in 2012 because he had published few cartoons on politicians. Then in 2012 and 13, we know that a lot of protests were going on in Tamil Nadu against the Kudankulam nuclear power plant. And the sedition case was filed against almost the complete village which was protesting against this particular nuclear power plant. Similarly, recently in 2020, Amulya Leona was booked under sedition because she raised slogan Pakistan Zindabad along with various other countries' names which she took. Then many sedition cases have been filed against the protester demanding revocation or reversal of Citizenship Amendment Act 2019. So clearly we can see that as far as the use of sedition law is concerned, clearly dissent, criticism of government and questioning of politicians and government policies, all of which are very fundamental to a democracy, have come to be treated as sedition by police. Okay, if this is the case, then let's see how many of these cases which are filed initially lead to conviction in the same offense. And so the graph which you see on your screen shows the number of cases related to sedition filed across the country in a particular year, and which ranges between 30, and in 2018 it went up to 7. And so in general around 30 to 50 cases are filed each year dealing with sedition. Filing of cases are not important. What is important is upholding of these cases by the judiciary, that is leading to final conviction. Only then we will know that the sedition case filed by the police upheld the scrutiny of the judiciary. And if you see that data, it is dismally 1 per year. In 2016, 17 and in 18, 1 and 2 cases led to conviction out of more than 60 to 70 filed that year, which in itself shows that most of the cases which are filed failed to stand up to the scrutiny of the judiciary. And why is that? And that is because of the two important judgments. One is Kedarnath Singh versus State of Bihar, and next one is Kanhaiya Kumar case. The judgments given by the Supreme Court in both these cases act as a guiding light for judiciary in order to determine the case under 124A or the sedition law. So this particular case took place in 1962, where the Supreme Court upheld section 124A and held that section 124 struck the correct balance between fundamental rights and the need for public order. So the validity of section 124A was challenged, and it was proposed that it violates the fundamental right. But Supreme Court held that no, it does not. And in fact, it is a right balance between the need for a public order, we need laws to ensure public order, and fundamental rights. But the court had significantly reduced the scope of sedition law. And what it did is that it limited the scope to only those cases where there is an incitement to imminent violence towards the overthrow of the state. Incitement to imminent violence. So, any speech, action or publication which calls for immediate violent step against the overthrowing of the government or the state will attract sedition. Further, the court said that it is not mere against government of the day, but the institutions as the symbol of the state. So after this important judgment, now it has become clear that unless and until the speech which calls for immediate violent overthrow of the government of India or the state of India. Except the police is able to demonstrate this imminent danger to the stability of the state, there shall not be any sedition case. And similarly, in Kanhaiya Kumar case, the Supreme Court redefined seditious act only if it had essential ingredients, and it listed out three: disruption of public order, attempt to violently overthrow a government, or threatening the security of the state. And now you can easily understand that why, even though the number of cases which are filed are 50 to 70 each year, but only one or two of them lead to conviction, only because these two Supreme Court guidelines are on work. And now an obvious question which arises is that when the conviction rate is so low, why police even files the cases? And for that, we will have to revisit the provisions of section 124A. We know that this offense is cognizable and non-bailable. And so whenever the government is threatened by an publication or political opponents, as soon as the case is filed, bail as a matter of right is denied. And for getting the bail, that person will have to first knock on the doors of the judiciary. And so what is guaranteed is few days, weeks, or even months of jail term, or police or judicial remand. And that threat is used to stifle the dissent or free speech. And that is why so many cases are filed even though they do not lead to conviction. And hence, prominent public thinkers have argued against this particular seditious law and called for its removal. At the same time, we know that this law is here to stay and there is no proposed amendment for this particular act. And so we'll discuss arguments for and against sedition law. So the first and foremost argument is that it is against democratic norms, just for the simple reason that it was enacted by the Britishers against the Indian people. It, in its basic nature, in its core, it stifles the democratic and fundamental right of people to criticize the government. And more often than not, it is used just for the same purpose. Then the next argument is the inadequate capacity of the local police stations to be able to judge the merit of a sedition case. We know that the cases are filed by the police, and the police might not have the requisite training to understand the consequences of imposing such a stringent provision. They might not be able to understand the nuances of section 124A. It is very difficult to understand the difference between expressing disagreement with the government policy or expressing disloyalty towards the government. And both can be mistaken, and so we don't have such capacity of state machinery. Then just for the simple reason that it has been misused more often than it has been used. It has been imposed arbitrarily. As we have seen with examples, it has been used arbitrarily to curb dissent. In many cases, the main targets have been writers, journalists, activists who question government policy and the projects, and even political dissenters. Then, as the crime, as we have seen, is non-bailable and punishment can extend for life, it has a strong deterrent effect on dissent even if it ultimately does not lead to conviction. And finally, since this provision has been mostly used to gag the fourth pillar of our democracy, that is the press, just this simple reason that most of the cases have been filed against the journalist is a strong enough reason as an argument and a strong argument against sedition law. But it's not as simple as it seems. There are some very solid points which indicate because of which the sedition law is still in existence. So, against the argument that it is a draconian law, the people who argue in favor say that it is not really a draconian law anymore, because now we have Supreme Court guidelines which have narrowed down significantly the jurisdiction of sedition law, and it can be applied only on grounds laid down by the Supreme Court. So the draconian nature has been curtailed, and so there is no need to dilute or remove it. Then for all those people who say that this particular sedition law violates the fundamental right to free speech, the argument can be made out that Article 19(1) provides for various kinds of freedom, but Article 19(2) provides for reasonable restrictions. And if you see, safety and security of India and any law enacted to preserve that comes under the reasonable restrictions and will not be void of Article 19(1). And so, sedition law is actually an application of reasonable restriction provided for in 19(2). then the argument that it curbs the free speech also does not hold according to some people, because the explanations given in section 124A have made it very clear that one can use any kind of strong language in criticism of government policies, schemes and actions without inviting sedition. Such freedom or dissent should not be turned into some kind of persuasion to break the country itself. And so that is why it is important to have a sedition law. And then one of the strongest argument comes from the existence of anti-national elements. In our country, we have terrorists, Naxals, who not only incite violence against the government but also produce literature which tries to sow the seed of disaffection against the Indian state. And so, due to the presence of anti-national elements and divisive forces such as Naxalites, separatists, it is important to have such a provision in law. And finally, for any law, the misuse can never be discounted, even starting from anti-dowry provision to provisions to penalize the murder. All have been misused, and mere misuse of a law cannot be ground for its repeal. And so in the mains examination, you could be expected to not only produce the arguments for and against, but also as a bureaucrat or as a future bureaucrat, come up with way forward or a solution. And so the way forward could be the continuance of sedition law, but incorporation of the Supreme Court guidelines given in Kedarnath case and Kanhaiya case into the law. So Article 124A should be amended to include the grounds given by the Supreme Court in these two cases into the Act itself. Then there is a need for sensitization of the police or police training. They should be sufficiently guided as to where the section must be imposed and where not. And finally, there is a need to include provisions where the government can be penalized if this particular section is misused. This will ensure that section 124A of IPC strikes a balance between security and smooth functioning of the state, along with fundamental right of freedom of speech and expression preserved. So this brings us to the end of the first discussion. In the mains examination, you would be expected to know the meaning of the definition of the sedition, from where it comes into Indian legal scene, what the section 124A says or how is it worded, why is it not the wording but the actual use of this particular provision which is problematic, what two important Supreme Court judgments have said, what are the arguments for and against this particular act, and finally, what could be the way forward. Let us now move on to the next discussion. The next item of discussion are basically a set of two articles, both appearing on page number 6. Say no to corporate houses in Indian banking, page number 6. Dangerous suggestion, page number 6. So let us just get a little bit of context into this particular news. In June 2020, RBI had appointed internal working group to review the ownership guidelines and corporate structure of Indian private banks. And one of the most contentious recommendations submitted by this committee is to allow large corporate or industrial houses to be the promoters of Indian banks. Now, of course, you can think of this as the acceptance of entry of large corporate houses such as Reliance, Tata, to set up private banks in India. Now, on one hand, the entry of these corporate houses into banking sector would enhance competition in the banking sector, would definitely promote higher efficiency and lead to development of mega-sized banks to support the credit needs of 5 trillion economy. But on the other hand, some of the experts such as ex-RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan believes that such a move would be a bad idea. And hence in this context, these two articles appear, both of them talking about important arguments against the entry of such corporate sector or industrial mega houses into banking sector. And hence, it becomes important for us to first understand the present status or state of banking sector. Then we will understand as to what corporate or industrial houses mean, what their entry would entail for banking sector, both with its merit as well as arguments against, and finally, what could be the way out of this situation. So starting the discussion with the present status of India's banking sector. And there are three main features as far as current state of Indian banking is concerned. First is the underdeveloped banking sector, government's monopoly in banking sector, and higher efficiency of private banks as compared to public sector banks. Now starting with the state of underdevelopment of banking sector. Now, you have to first understand that the growth of any economy is actually fueled by the credit, which in most cases are supplied by banks. And so, larger the banks, larger the credit supply, higher the growth rate. So, in case of India, the banking sector has, of course, grown significantly over the years. But the total balance sheet of banks in India still constitutes less than 70% of the GDP. Now, this data is irrelevant if we do not compare it with other countries. Now, if you do the comparison, this is much lower as compared to global powers such as China, for which the same number is 170%, and for Japan, the same number is 110%. Apart from this, as highlighted by Economic Survey of 2019 and 20, the Indian banking sector has remained small. You can say it has remained dwarf in comparison to the size of our economy. Take for instance India's largest bank SBI. It ranks at 55th position globally. Whereas if you see the share of China and USA in top banks, you will clearly understand the difference. So one of the realities of the current banking status of our country is the underdevelopment of banking sector. It is still not geared to provide for high growth rate of our economy. Then the next important feature is the government's monopoly in the banking sector. So monopoly in simple terms means dominance, and with respect to market, it means lack of competition. So in case of India, especially in the banking sector, the public sector banks or government banks hold the monopoly. And the data also indicates the same, because public sector banks in India account for 70% of the market share, not just the market share, also the share of the risks, because the PSBs account for 80% of overall NPAs of the banking sector. The NPAs of PSBs is around 12% and is much higher as compared to non-public sector banks. So you can see how dominant public sector banks are in overall banking sector. And the final feature of current banking system in India is a very high efficiency of private banks. Now, how can we judge the efficiency of banks? One way to do that is to look at the return on investments. 1 rupee which goes into PSBs fetches a market value of just 71 paise or 0.71 rupees. If you compare this to the private sector, it converts 1 rupee into 3.70 rupees for its firm. This data has been given by Economic Survey of 2019 and 20. So clearly you can see that the return from the private sector bank is around 5 times that of a public sector bank. This obviously shows that taxpayers' money is being inefficiently deployed in public sector banks, which in turn is leading to loss of both government as well as taxpayers' money. Now, this discussion started with the present status, because if you look at all three indicators, they point towards something. They point towards higher efficiency of private sector banks, monopoly of public sector banks, and monopoly of anyone is bad for market, and underdevelopment of banking sector, which again points towards higher and higher participation of private sector into banking in India, which is obviously allowed. What has not been allowed so far is the participation of corporate and mega industrial houses. Now, what is the definition of corporate houses or industrial houses? A large corporate industrial business house is defined as a group having total assets of rupees 5,000 crore or more, wherein the non-financial business of the group accounts for more than 40% in terms of total assets or gross income. So these are the two conditions which needs to be satisfied for a group to be qualified as large corporate or industrial house, or what we call in Hindi as Audyogik Gharana, which are basically Reliance, Tata and Birlas. Now the question arises as to when we have already allowed private sector to operate in banking, to open private banks. What is the problem? If corporates and large industrial houses will open the banks, why is there so much of an opposition to that? And that we will understand when we will discuss the argument against the entry of corporate houses into banking sector. But before that, let's continue from the present status, which is dominated by the public sector banks. The public sector banks are very inefficient, and overall penetration of the banking sector or the size of banking sector in our country is very small. And so that is why a lot of people propose, including the committee by RBI, that industrial houses, given that they have huge financial edge, should be allowed to open banks. So of course, with regard to small size of India's banking sector, the entry of Reliance and Tatas and whatever these industrial houses will bring in much needed capital as well as expertise along with them, of course, which will indeed improve the credit to GDP ratio and facilitate investment driven model, of course. So that is commonsensical. Then, with regards to the government's monopoly, the entry of these large corporate houses will reduce the government's monopoly in banking sector. And the best example can be taken from the telecom sector as well as from the aviation sector, both of which were earlier just limited to the public sector, and later on they were privatized, and it was allowed for private sector to enter, and now we can see how efficient, large they are and how beneficial it has been for the consumers. Then the entry of private banks, obviously we know, will make it more efficient. But the entry of these large corporate houses will infuse massive level of competition, as is seen in case of Jio versus Airtel, and that similar kind of competition will be there in the banking sector as well, which will eventually be beneficial for the consumer. Then one important aspect is the importance of banks in reaping socio-economic development or benefits. So for example, government is dependent on banks for a lot of schemes, and the best example would be the JAM Trinity, which is incomplete without banks. Now, in a lot of areas, the public sector banks simply fail to reach to the poorest. Similarly, there are other benefits which the government wants to take to the consumers or the citizens, but it simply cannot because of the limited capacity of the banks and their reach. Now, with the entry of large industrial houses, the government could leverage these private sector banks for the socio-economic development. Of course, it will be a matter of argument whether they will be interested in delivering to the lowest strata of the society or not. But no one knows whether the innovation can also lead to the profit even in the poorest section of the society. And then finally, many countries and even many developed countries across the world have not banned the entry of large corporates in their banking sector. So it obviously points to a direction that there is no need for India to worry about them. But things are not that easy, and we will understand why. The arguments against the entry of these large corporate houses holds more merit than the arguments in favor. And let us understand these. Now, first and foremost argument is that whenever we say that our banking sector is dominated by public sector banks, it is a bad thing. But the observation that so many recessions have struck the global economy, in last one being in 2007 and 8, the global economy was devastated, but the impact was minimal in case of India, and that was only because our banking sector was dominated by public sector banks. It was the public sector domination which prevented the dynamo effect to reach to India. Then an important argument against the entry of large corporates into Indian banking sector is that it will involve massive conflict of interest and it will lead to interconnected lending. Now let us just understand what this means. So we have large corporate houses and they have a lot of ventures, starting from selling salt to manufacturing cars to providing telecom services, and they earn profits from these ventures. Now let's say they are allowed to open the banks, and let's say this large corporate house has opened a bank. Of course, after it is giving license, it will be able to collect deposits naturally, and then it will be able to lend money to the borrowers. Now, interconnected lending means that these large corporate houses will utilize their banks to turn their own banks into easy source of money. They will fuel all the money from the depositors into their own projects. They can also misuse their own banks to provide finance to their own customers and suppliers of their business. And now this is a problem. This is a gross conflict of interest. Not just that, it might also lead to contagion impact. Larger the company, larger the interest, and higher the risks. And so, the banks owned by corporate houses will always be exposed to risks of the non-banking entities of the group. Then the next set of challenge comes from the regulation. We know that currently the banking sector, the private banking sector is regulated by RBI. Now we have ample proofs to suggest that current supervision is poor and there is oversight in regulation. For example, what happened with Yes Bank and Lakshmi Nivas Bank has exposed the weaknesses in supervision. And so the failure of the banks promoted by large corporate houses would be disastrous because they would be massive. And the reason behind that is overburdening of RBI. RBI's staff is very low and a lot of work is handled by them, leading to poor supervision and regulatory oversight. And so this will also become one of the way forwards to suggest to increase the number of employees in RBI for banking supervision. And then finally, an important aspect of entry of large corporates into banking sector would be the concentration of political and economic power into few hands. You know that banking licenses will be given by RBI, and so there will be a lot of discretion in the hands of government as well as RBI. So political biasness is going to play a big role in issuance of licenses to corporate houses. Then the government support might also lead to anti-competitive practices and promotion of crony capitalism. Now so far it is not possible because the banking sector which operate in private domain have no other business interests. But once these mega corporations and business houses will enter, they will have not only the access to large capital but also will bring crony capitalism into banking sector. And so these are the reasons because of which even RBI has so far resisted to issue banking licenses to large corporates. In February 2013, RBI had issued guidelines that permitted corporate and industrial houses to apply for banking license. However, no corporate was ultimately given a bank license. Only two entities qualified for license, we know, IDFC and Bandhan Bank. This clearly shows that presently the RBI is itself not very comfortable with issuing licenses to corporate houses. Hence, we need to be extra cautious in issuing licenses to corporate houses. And so, there are few way forwards. The first is, we should first strengthen the banking regulation. Why do we need to strengthen the banking regulation? To prevent interconnected lending. For example, the Federal Reserve Act in USA prohibits financial transactions of the banks and their affiliates. Hence, amendment to banking regulation should be done in order to prevent interconnected lending. Then next is consolidated supervision. Now, RBI must be empowered to carry out the consolidated supervision of the banks and apart from banks, their non-banking entities to avoid any kind of conflict. So far, the RBI just had a mandate for supervision of banks. But once the industrial houses will enter the banking sector, RBI should be enabled to check the parent and their company as well. Then we talked about the overburdening of RBI and its staff. We need to strengthen the supervisory cadre. So for example, the RBI has set up a specialized supervisory and regulatory cadre, acronymed as SSRC, in November 2019 to strengthen and consolidate the supervision functions, which was scattered across different departments. Now SSRC needs to be strengthened and given proper training. Then finally, we need wide-ranging reforms in public sector banks. The failure of Yes Bank and Lakshmi Nivas Bank has highlighted that it is not the ownership structure, rather the quality of corporate governance, which determines the efficiency of the banks. Because even Lakshmi Nivas Bank and Yes Bank were private sector banks, but they failed because they were not following the best practices of corporate governance. And hence the government must also give due amount of emphasis on reforming PSBs according to the recommendations of PJ Nayak committee. So the entry of industrial houses, large corporate houses into banking sector has been a talked about issue since a very long time. And since the RBI's committee has almost recommended this, means that the discussion will go on. And hence in this context, it is important for you to keep in mind the present status of banking sector. What are large corporate houses? How are they defined? And what are the arguments in favor of entry of such corporate houses? What are the arguments against? And if the government wants to enable corporate houses into banking sector, the government first should carry out few reforms, without which the entry of corporate houses will be just a disaster. Let's now move on to the next discussion. Next news item which we have taken appears on page number 10. Poshan Abhiyan needs a boost. So National Nutrition Mission, or the Poshan Abhiyan, the world's largest nutrition program for children and mothers, must be stepped up to meet the target set by Center to reduce stunting, wasting and anemia by 2022, says the Niti Aayog report. Now, a clear-cut understanding of Poshan Abhiyan is important for two reasons. First is that it's obviously important for the perspective of prelims examination. The features of the schemes and its initiatives can be directly asked in prelims examination. But from the perspective of mains examination, it is important because issues related to vulnerable sections and issues related to health and education appears prominently in GS paper 2. And questions in the past about the analysis of midday meal scheme have already been asked. And so, since this important report has been published, it becomes important for us to first understand what Poshan Abhiyan entails to do, why it has not been able to achieve the targets it was designed for. So, Poshan Abhiyan, or also known as National Nutrition Mission, is the world's largest nutrition program to improve the nutritional outcomes for children, pregnant women, and lactating mothers. So, the target groups are three. Now, let us train our attention towards the targets of Poshan Abhiyan. The first target of Poshan Abhiyan is to prevent and reduce stunting in children below the age of 6 at the rate of 2% per annum. It intends to prevent and reduce underweight in children below the age of 6 at the rate of 2% per annum. Then it intends to reduce the prevalence of anemia among children at the rate of 3% per annum. Then it aims to reduce the prevalence of anemia among women and adolescent girls in the age group of 15 to 49, basically the age group which is expected to become mother, at the rate of 3% per annum, and reduce low birth weight at the rate of 2% per annum. So what is the current trend or status of the nutrition or the malnutrition in our country? And that data is given by National Family and Health Survey, and this was the fourth report which we are going to use, which was published in 2015 and 16, according to which 38% of children under 5 years were stunted. Stunting means too short for their age but not necessarily thin. Whereas 21% of them were wasted, which means too thin for their height but not necessarily short. So around 38% were stunted, 21% were wasted, 7.5% were severely wasted, and 35.8% were underweight. Now if you compare this data to that of 10 years ago, that is in 2005 and 6, you can see the reduction in almost all of them. Now the current report of Niti Aayog has laid emphasis on accelerating the actions on multiple fronts as far as Poshan Abhiyan is concerned, because Niti Aayog thinks that the steps are not bearing fruit rapidly on the ground, because there are reasons. And so in the mains examination, you could be asked as to what are the reasons behind still continuing large scale malnutrition in our country. And the reasons behind that is, first, household food insecurity. We know still large scale prevalence of poverty and hunger, which manifests in inadequate care and unhealthy household environment, lack of healthcare service and untimely intervention or lack of timely interventions, repeated attack of diarrhea and infection leads to weight loss and compromises on child's nutritional status. We know that during childhood, if a kid is hit with multiple waves of infectious diseases, then the capacity of the body to absorb nutrition is also hindered, and that what leads to the malnutrition. So apart from household food insecurity, poverty and lack of healthcare services, lack of sanitation and clean drinking water are one of the biggest reasons behind high level of malnutrition and the strongest reason behind Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. Strong evidences exist to suggest that good sanitation practices have helped to curb malnutrition drastically. We need to understand that malnutrition is an intergenerational stuff. Mother being unhealthy gives rise to unhealthy child. And so especially in areas like UP and Bihar, where the malnutrition is prevalent since 5 to 6 to 7 generations, just an intervention of single generation, that is for only 5 years, is not going to bear fruits immediately. It will take at least 50 years to remove malnutrition. Then Another factor is the climate change, which is impacting the global food system in ways that increase the threats to those who currently already suffer from hunger and undernutrition. And just to demonstrate this simple fact, that climate change is increasing the vulnerability of already vulnerables. So, for example, people living in drought prone areas are already very compromised as far as food security is concerned. And the impact of climate change is making it difficult for them to cope up because it is increasing the frequency of the drought. So, in that way, it is leading to malnutrition. So, from the perspective of prelims examination, the objectives of Poshan Abhiyan are important. And from the perspective of mains examination, it is important to know that even after Poshan Abhiyan, the task of drastically reducing the malnutrition from the country will be a difficult job. Let's now move on to the next discussion. Then the next article is Government Orders Priority for Local Tenders. Now we know that government has tightened its procurement norms to make it tougher for ministries to pursue global tenders for contracts worth up to 200 crores. Any ministry seeking an exemption to the norm in order to call for global tender inquiry is required to seek the Cabinet Secretariat's prior nod. So basically the government has been taking a lot of steps which in a way are promoting Atmanirbhar Bharat. And so what we have done today is that this is a smaller news and we have compiled all those steps taken by the government of India to promote Atmanirbhar Bharat, or the vision of self-reliant India as promoted by current Prime Minister Mr. Narendra Modi, especially in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. So of course the major steps should come from the commerce and industry. And so in order to promote local manufacturing, Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, DPIIT, which is a wing of Ministry of Commerce and Industry, amended the public procurement rules, Public Procurement Preference to Make in India Order 2017, to do three important things. The first is to ensure that only items with minimum 20% local content can participate in government tenders. Now it has been ensured that only items with minimum 20% local content can participate in tenders floated by the government or any of its entities. And it has also made it compulsory to give preference to local suppliers while awarding tenders. Items with more than 50% local content will get purchase preference over other items. So if you want to be a supplier for Government of India, increase your local content. That is, manufacture in India. Then a class 1 local supplier has been defined, and they will be the only ones eligible to bid for contracts that has sufficient domestic capacity. Now what are these class 1 local suppliers? They are those suppliers which have local content of equal to or more than 50%. So this was just about normal industries and government acquisition. The new defense acquisition procedure of 2020 has reserved several procurement categories for indigenous or Indian firms. The categories of buy, Indian design, developed and manufactured, make 1, make 2 will be exclusively reserved for Indian vendors. Then government has decided to impose safeguard duty on some of the goods such as solar panel cells to promote domestic manufacturing. Now government is also aiming to boost manufacturing and global imprint of Indian toys. Significantly, the toy market is one of the several markets which are flooded with the Chinese products. Toys can be an excellent medium to further the spirit of Ek Bharat, Shreshtha Bharat. Toys can reflect India's value system and culturally established environment-friendly approach. Another startling observation has been the growth of personal protective equipment or PPE sector from almost zero in March to producing pieces a day by the beginning of July. Then India's own Made in India 5G network was announced in July 2020 by Reliance Jio. So these are the steps, partly from the private sector, mostly from the government sector, which have been taken to ensure self-reliant India or Atmanirbhar Bharat. This next news appears on page number 10. Sputnik 5 shows interim efficacy of 91%. So this Russian COVID-19 vaccine candidate Sputnik 5 has shown an interim efficacy of 91% based on analyzing results from nearly 18,000 volunteers, some of whom got the actual vaccine and others a placebo. This has been stated by the Russian Direct Investment Fund yesterday. In our past discussion in DNS, we have already discussed most of the candidate vaccines, whether it is Oxford, AstraZeneca, Moderna or Pfizer. And we have discussed these vaccines with respect to whether they are a live virus, attenuated virus, or they are mRNA based vaccines. And so in this regard, it is important to discuss few of the basic features of this Sputnik 5 vaccine by Russia. So first, let us talk about the vector, or what will be actual carrier of the gene to the body. So a vector is a virus that lacks a gene responsible for reproduction. We know that virus goes into our body and it utilizes the cell's mechanism to multiply itself. And so a vector is a mutated virus that lacks that particular gene which is responsible for reproduction. And hence it is used to transport genetic material from another virus that is being vaccinated against into a cell. Let us understand. So this orange spherical object is our SARS coronavirus 2 or nCovid. And you can see the spike proteins on its surface. And these blue hexagons are adenovirus vector 1 and adenovirus vector 2. So the gene from adenovirus which causes the infection is removed, which is basically to make them harmless. But in that place, the gene of coronavirus, which is responsible for production of these spiky proteins, are added on to the genetic material of adenovirus. So from adenovirus, harmful sequences are knocked out, whereas the code which is responsible for the production of spike protein are added on to the adenovirus. And then the vaccine will contain these two vectors. Once injected into the body, since they have the code which is responsible for the manufacture or production of spike protein, once injected into the body, they will lead to the production of spiky proteins without coronavirus ever having entered the body. And this is what will induce the body's defense mechanism to produce antibodies against these spike proteins without having been exposed to the actual coronavirus. And that is what will immunize the body from COVID, because when the actual COVID will visit a person who has already been vaccinated, they will already have antibodies against these spike proteins. A peculiar trait of this particular vaccine would be double vaccination. First vaccination followed by second vaccination after a period of 21 days. Now the use of human adenovirus as vectors is safe because these viruses which cause common cold are not novel and have been around for thousands of years. So this is it as far as today's DNS is concerned. Let us now have a look at answers to the true and false statements followed by question of the day.